So welcome everyone to this research seminar by Learn. Really pleased to have a talk by Professor Iroise Dumontheil, who is on our advisory board as well. She'll be talking about executive functions and academic achievements, and I'll give Nienke van Attenveld, one of our program leaders, the opportunity to introduce her in a bit more detail. But I just wanted to say also that this is particularly relevant for us as well, because we've been evaluating the catch-up programs in primary and secondary education in the Netherlands over the past 2 years. And we've seen that particularly secondary schools have organized quite a lot of programs in which they are aiming to improve students' executive functions. And there's been quite a lot of discussion around whether it's even something that can be trained in a school context. So hopefully we'll have some discussion to talk about that as well. Nienke, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you, Melanie. So yeah, the positive side of the situation that we're still stuck with Zoom seminars is that we can invite excellent international speakers. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Professor Iroise Dumontheil, on behalf of the Educational Neuroscience Research Program that Melanie mentioned. Iroise is a renowned professor in the field of educational neuroscience, and her expertise is on social cognition and executive functions during development and adulthood. Iroise is originally from France. She got her PhD in 2006 at the University Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris, after which she moved to the UK. And she worked in several outstanding labs, for example, at UCL and Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And in 2012, she settled at Birkbeck University of London, where she became a full professor in 2020. And today she will present her latest work on the relation between executive functions and academic achievement. So looking forward to hearing more about that. So the floor is yours, Iroise.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Nienke, for introducing me and for inviting me to present at this seminar. So this is a sort of new set of slides I put together. Some work is a little bit older, some work is kind of a bit more recent, but hopefully it fits together. Just kind of a little bit about me, you've heard already, but I'm studying kind of social and cognitive control development during adolescence in particular, but now I've kind of extended a little bit the age range to also look at children. And I use a combination of kind of different methods, but including neuroimaging and sort of some genetic and behavioral tests. I'm also since I joined Birkbeck, I joined the Center for Educational Neuroscience, which a little bit like Learn is trying to kind of sort of virtual center combining different institutions. And as part of this, I've also kind of been more interested in, what our research means in terms of education and in cognitive training programs. So today I'm going to try and briefly talk about cognitive control and its development, and then the link with education. And then I will focus in particular on more recent work we've been doing, looking at science and maths counterintuitive reasoning as one aspect of academic achievement. And then present one intervention that we've developed and tested the last few years, which we call the stop and think. So cognitive control is the ability to flexibly adapt one's behavior in the pursuit of an internal goal by the coordination of cognitive processes. And there was a recent thing on Twitter, a thread saying, does it actually exist? Is this a real thing in the brain? And the thing is, like, it's a construct, and we're still trying to figure out how it's implemented on the brain as like different component to it. But it's still useful in terms of a topic of interest and of research. So another word for cognitive control is kind of executive functions, and they've been split in a range of different components. And one of them is inhibitory control, which is the ability to stop inappropriate prepotent responses and ignore distractions. Working memory is the ability to temporarily monitor, maintain, and manipulate information in a mental workspace. Attention, which can or cannot be within executive functions, but it's a very related construct, is separated in the ability to sustain, divide, or selectively orient attention. And you can see already that when selectively orienting your attention, ignoring kind of distractors is kind of quite related to inhibitory control. And then switching and flexibility, which is the ability to switch or shift between mental states, rule sets, or tasks, and kind of to have more flexible thinking. So these inhibitory control, working memory, and switching tend to be considered as sort of core executive functions and have been studied a lot. However, there are a whole range of other aspects of cognitive control or executive functions that are important and that in a way build on these maybe more core EF. And these are things like planning, time management, multitasking, prospective memory, which is remembering to do something in the future, problem solving and self-monitoring, and metacognition is something quite related, which is kind of the awareness of possibly your goals and your behavior and your thoughts, and that can be kind of quite related and building on executive function skills. So all these aspects of cognitive control continue to mature for quite a long time during development. So as an example, this is work I did, well, Ninka mentioned I spent time at the Karolinska Institute. So this was with Torkel Klingberg there. And looking at participants who completed a visual working memory task where you see dots presented in an array and you have to retrace the location of the dots on the screen. And this is a longitudinal sample. And you can see that performance on the task increased kind of linearly pretty much between childhood and sort of mid-adolescence, and then kind of increased, but more slowly during later adolescence. Other tasks that are used to study executive functions, a very famous one is the Stroop task, where you have to name the color of the font of words, and if they're incongruent, so for example, red written in a yellow font, it's much harder. But there are also tasks that we use with primary school children, things like Simon Says in English, which is Jacques a dit in French, and I don't actually how you might say it in Dutch, but where you have to follow instructions, and you only do it if someone says touch your head, and then you touch your head. But if you say touch your knees, but you haven't Simon Says, then you have to resist following the instruction. So you have the kind of this competition between doing something and not doing something. So it's kind of another more everyday life, gamey way of looking at inhibitory control. In a very large study, cross-cultural study, Larry Steinberg, a researcher in the States who's done a lot of work in adolescence, has looked at more than 5,000 individuals between 10 and 30, whole range of countries. And they had a Stroop task, a Tower of London task, which is a sort of test of planning, as well as a sort of questionnaire about a few questions about self-reported, about planning abilities. And creating a composite from these different tasks, they looked at how performance cross-sectionally differed between different ages. And you can see that there was a very significant improvement in performance between 10 and the sort of mid-20s, where it plateaus. So cognitive control skills continue to improve for a very long time in adolescence and even until early adulthood. I use kind of neuroimaging to also investigate development, and been looking at the neural correlates of cognitive control development. I don't have time to go into lots of details, but the changes in behavior in cognitive control skills have been associated with prolonged changes in cortical structure, in particular in the frontal cortex, and also in white matter tracks that are connecting, for example, the prefrontal cortex to the parietal cortex, but also between more subcortical regions and the prefrontal cortex. And in terms of function, there are changes in brain activation. They're quite consistently observed in the parietal cortex with increase in activation with age during adolescence. In the prefrontal cortex, the picture is much more varied. So during development, we sometimes see increases, decreases within the same study in different brain regions. And there's still not kind of a clear pattern that is emerging, except that possibly these changes might reflect more specialization of the frontal cortex during development. So it could be that at earlier ages, the whole of the prefrontal cortex is recruited for a whole range of sort of harder tasks where you engage in cognitive control. But then gradually during development, you may have kind of separation of different executive aspects of executive functions, and they might be associated with specific networks, including the prefrontal cortex. So some of them become less active because there's less specifically activated, recruited in that particular executive skills, while other regions are become more and more specialized for their skills, so maybe an increase in activation. But this is still something that's being kind of trying to kind of figure out. Importantly, that there are a lot of individual differences in development of the kind of skills. So for example, this is a longitudinal study by Christian Tamnes in Norway, and this is looking at a working memory performance. And you can see that first, just cross-sectionally, or at age 15, you have a whole range of accuracy on this working memory task. And during development, you might have children who, for example, at this age, this one doesn't improve a lot between 12 and 13, while this one improves a lot. So you have a lot of differences between individuals in terms of their capacity and also the developmental trajectory. And it's the same in the brain. So this is, for example, a study where, again, a longitudinal study looking at tractography, so the property of white matter tracks. And the different colors here reflect the changes, whether you have increases, decreases in fractional anisotropy or no change, so in kind of characteristics of the white matter. And you can see at different ages, at each age, you can have kind of a proportion of participants who might show change in one direction, some in the other direction. And so there's kind of a lot of variability between individuals. So just to summarize this first part, cognitive control allow goal-directed behavior, and their prolonged maturation of cognitive control skills into early adulthood, as well as associated changes in brain structure and brain function. And importantly, they're marked individual differences in cognitive control abilities and in brain and cognitive maturation. So what about the link, because that's kind of what of interest today, the link between cognitive control and education? Well, the common view is that cognitive control is crucial in most classroom settings. And first, very broadly, in allowing you to attend and to concentrate on, for example, what the teacher is saying, not being distracted by your peers, by noise outside, by thinking about your dinner, and whether that's in class or at home when you're doing your homework and you have to maybe resist looking at your phone, watching TV, and you have kind of to concentrate on your homework, remember what you need to do, remember to take your, the right books for the right day at school. So all of these kind of aspects, kind of more broad aspects that enable you to sort of succeed, attend and concentrate in schools are related to cognitive control capacities. More kind of specifically, cognitive control, as I said, is associated with your ability to monitor your performance. And so, for example, if you notice you make an error, then you can learn from it. If you're not noticing you're making an error, you might kind of not learn as much from it. And then whether you adapt your performance, your strategies after making an error, it will also be beneficial or not. And this is, for example, not directly looking at individual differences in cognitive control, but Suzanne de Mouge, who's been a PhD student in Amsterdam and kind of Birkbeck, she's kind of been looking at that in a big data set of Math Garden, trying to look at when children make errors, do they then slow down? Is that associated with better performance afterwards when, for example, they're doing maths or language tasks? But there are also kind of much more domain-specific associations. So one that has been studied quite a lot, and I have looked at in the past, is between working memory and mathematics, for example. So cognitive control is important for like kind of broader control of behavior in a classroom or at home, but also specifically in helping you, it seems to be in your learning in particular domains. So, for example, as I said, working memory has been associated with maths. We say math broadly, but really it's more arithmetic specifically that has been looked at in these studies. And this is again work I did with Torkel Klingberg in Stockholm, in a study where we're looking at children aged 6 to 16, and they were tested at 2 time points on the arithmetic test. And we're trying to see what might predict the performance 2 years later. And looking at behavior, that task I mentioned before, this visual working memory task, as well as the Raven matrices, which is kind of reasoning task, visual spatial reasoning task, a backwards digits and 3-back task, which were more about verbal working memory together, they explains 30% of variance in arithmetic 2 years later when you control for arithmetic at time 1. But we were also interested in whether brain activity might give us any additional information about a kind of prediction of arithmetic performance 2 years later. And partly this is of interest because the intraparietal sulcus, which is a brain region that is consistently activated in working memory tasks, is also activated when children or adults are doing numerical comparison and kind of arithmetic tasks. So there seems to be neural overlap between working memory and arithmetic. And so the question is like, well, if you're doing a working memory task, does individual differences in activity during this working memory task, would that predict how well you're doing, how well you're learning arithmetic over the course of 2 years? And we found that it did. Just by itself, the brain data explain kind of 5% of variance in a kind of smaller sample. And if you control for behavioral performance, it explains specifically just a couple, 2-3% more of variance. But it was kind of one of the sort of proof of concept that actually some brain data could be informative for this. Lucy Craig, who's a researcher at University of Nottingham, has also been doing quite a lot of work on this, and she's in particularly been interested in trying to see whether you can decompose arithmetic performance in different aspects. So, for example, she split it into factual knowledge, procedural skills, which is kind of how to do, for example, particular addition, multiplication, subtractions, and conceptual understanding. And she was trying to see whether different aspects of cognitive control or executive functions might be specifically associated with these different components. And so she studied children 8, 9, 11, 12 years old, 13, 14, and young adults. And what she found was that individual differences in executive function explain 34% of variance in arithmetic. So quite a big component of it. Interestingly, contrary to what they were predicting initially, they didn't find that the associations changed with age. So across this kind of quite wide age range, they found that executive functions consistently associated with arithmetic performance. And in terms of specific skills, they found that working memory was actually associated with all 3 aspects, all 3 components. Inhibition of just factual knowledge and procedural skills were shifting, none of these kind of specifically. But still, when controlling for these particular skills, working memory was still had a kind of direct path in predicting arithmetic performance or cross-sectionally. And finally, a kind of another example of a study looking at how EEF executive functions might be related to academic achievement. This is work done by my former PhD students, Georgina Donati, and she used the ALSPAC dataset, which is a longitudinal dataset that was done in Bristol. And so it's quite a large sample. And she tried to see whether measures of working memory, processing speed, and inhibitory control might predict, in this case was GCSE scores, so standardized kind of tests at age 16 in the UK, for English, maths, and science, while controlling for age 11 performance and also considering other aspects of cognition, so reasoning, vocabulary, and as well as more environmental effects of SES. And what she found was that working memory, specifically predicting all of these 3 aspects of academic achievement over this kind of course of adolescence. And processing speed predicted some of it, but kind of a weaker effects, while inhibitory control, which unfortunately was a single measure in this data set, did not specifically predict performance when you're controlling for everything else. Right, so this is kind of looking at arithmetic a lot and kind of maths kind of broadly, but as I said, more recently, we've been interested in counterintuitive science and maths reasoning. And this is because both in science and maths, there are a lot of concepts that are or problems that are where the first response that might come to your mind might be incorrect. So for example, before children start school, things like gravity, inertia, or balance, they might have kind of intuitive understanding that is incorrect. One very easy example to think about this is the fact that the Earth goes around the sun. When we talk about it, it looks like the sun is moving in the sky. We talk about the sunrise and the sun sets as if it's the sun that's moving. And actually then children learn at school that it's the Earth, or from the parents, that it's the Earth that's going around the sun. So they have this kind of perception and a lot of kind of information they've gathered over the few years of life, and then they learn something that's completely contradictory to that. And other things like concepts about life and death and temperature and states of matter. And in adulthood, things like gravity and electrical circuits. For example, the fact that if you have two identical water bottles, one is full and one is empty, and you drop them and you ask adults, are they going to touch the ground at the same time? A lot of adults will say that the bottle that's filled with water, that's heavier, will touch the ground first, but actually it wouldn't. So gravity would have the same effect. That kind of acceleration is independent of the mass, and so they would land exactly the same time. But because in our everyday life we look at things that tend to be lighter, also tend to have like a bigger surface, and they end up, because of air friction, they end up kind of falling more slowly. We have this kind of intuition that things that are heavier fall faster, but actually it's incorrect. And in maths, there's also a lot of things. So for example, if you have a problem like this, children might say that the angle Y is larger than the angle X, but just because they're misled by the shape, the kind of longer arms of the branches. So this is longer, so it probably means that the angle is bigger as well. Things like looking at perimeter and surface area. These are two shapes that have the same surface area. And so the conclusion might be that they have the same perimeter, but actually they have different perimeters. And things about fractions. For a long time, children, they learn about integers, and 5 and 9, they're bigger numbers than 2 and 3. And so if you present them with a fraction like this, they think that this is going to be bigger than this because the numbers are bigger. There's a kind of, and in another example for decimal numbers, that 2.40 is bigger for them than 2.1 because 40 is bigger than 1. So it kind of misunderstanding of the decimal. So both science and maths, there's a lot of this type of issues that might, of kind of counterintuitive problems, they might come from kind of different sources. So again, it could be misleading from what you're perceiving right now, information on the screen, or the problem that is misleading you, or about knowledge you've acquired and experience you've had in your life before, also about things you've learned before. So for example, if you think about negative numbers, again, children for a very long time learn that 5 is bigger than 1, and suddenly they learn negative numbers, and now -5 is smaller than -1. And that kind of is completely contradictory to everything they've learned so far, and that makes it kind of harder for them to go beyond it. So they're suggesting that for a while there was a view that maybe once you learn the new concept, you kind of get rid of the incorrect concepts, and you just move on. Basically, you replace it. But evidence from behavioral studies suggests that participants are slower to do this response to these counterintuitive trials, suggesting that actually there's maybe a competition, and you still have the intuitive answer, the intuitive concept in your mind, and you have to kind of decide between the two. So there's this suggestion that when you're trying to solve a counterintuitive problem, you have to inhibit sort of intuitive heuristics rules. For example, if A is bigger than B in one way, then it's also going to be bigger than B in another way. So we're talking about the perimeter and the surface area. If the surface area is bigger in A than B, then the perimeter will also be bigger in A than B. And you can think about that in terms of volumes and height and all of the kind of different aspects. So these heuristics sort of rules quite often work fine, but in some cases they don't. And then in that case, you're supposed to engage, if you think about Daniel Kahneman, the kind of system 1, system 2, but you're supposed to engage this kind of slower, more logical reasoning process to try to kind of find the correct answer. And so there's the suggestion that when you are when you're kind of learning from kind of evidence-based instructions and learning new concepts in math and science, you might need to inhibit your prior beliefs, your experience, your direct perception in order to give the correct answer. And for this inhibition, you might, the typical brain regions that are often mentioned would be the anterior cingulate cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So then people have been trying to see, okay, can we see that? If we ask adults, for example, to solve counterintuitive reasoning problems, do we see activation in these brain regions, suggesting that indeed their brains are working harder, trying to inhibit the intuitive answers to give the correct answer? And recently, in a paper with that's in revision, I've tried to kind of put that evidence together from work. A lot of work has been done in Canada, but also by Stavin Babai in Israel. And in fact, so these are studies, for example, at the top, they're comparing incongruent trials where it would be counterintuitive, and congruent was the response is actually in line with your intuition. And I've in different colors represent the different studies. And you can see that, in fact, there's not that much consistency across studies in terms of which brain regions they activate. And in another comparison, they also quite often compare experts versus novices. So, for example, that might be physics undergraduates versus humanities undergraduates, asking them to solve problems about electricity and gravity. And if anything, there's maybe a little bit of consistency in this kind of left inferior frontal gyrus region or anterior insular region. But across the board, the studies have tended to conclude, okay, look, we find activation in the frontal cortex or ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and this is reflecting inhibitor control. But as you know, in fMRI research, reverse inference is a big problem. So you can't really make a conclusion about what aspects of cognition, what cognitive processes are recruited just on the basis of what brain regions are recruited, because there's not a kind of one-to-one mapping between cognitive processes and brain regions. Particular brain regions might be activated in a whole range of different aspects of cognition. And that makes it, of course, that makes our life harder. So what we were interested in studying this further and at different ages and trying to find kind of more evidence of this link between inhibitory control and counterintuitive reasoning in maths and science. And so this is work done by Annie Brookman. And so she designed kind of new problem sets. We're on a whole range, covering a whole range of topics, but just as an example, this was actually adapted from previous studies. Where this misconception about electricity is that you can need only one cable to light a lamp, a light bulb. While in fact, in a kind of standard electrical circuits, you need one wire coming in and one wire coming out. But this is kind of partly misled from what we see in our house, where we just have like one plug, but in fact, inside the plug, there are two wires. And so that's kind of the presenting kind of incorrect misconceptions, but the participants could also be presented with the correct version. So this shows that only one light bulb is lit. And control trials where there's no counterintuitive issue there, there's the wire is actually not actually connecting to the light bulb. So you know what the answer is, kind of, you don't have to inhibit your intuition. In maths, would be one about perimeters and surface area again. So, so this one, it says that the perimeter of the purple figure is bigger than the perimeter of the orange figure, because the misconception is that this surface area is larger, so the perimeter would be larger. But actually, if you look at it, this bit or this bit is actually would give you the same perimeter. And you could present it as a correct version or control trials. And so participants were presented with this and just had to say whether they were true or false, or definitely true or definitely false. And they were presented a whole range of topics because we wanted, so Annie looked at the curriculum for, which is the age 11 to 14 years old in the UK for secondary school, and tried to find a whole range of misconceptions that were from the topics of the curriculum at that age. And so that covered biology, chemistry, physics, and maths. And in a first behavioral study in 90 teenagers, 11 to 15 years old, what she found was that better semantic inhibition, so in a Stroop task, a Stroop reaction time cost, was associated with higher counterintuitive reasoning accuracy, explaining 5% of the variance when you were controlling for age and IQ and performance on control trials. And that better response inhibition, so no-go accuracy on no-go trials in a complex variance where you had the one back component, but not in a simple no-go trials, was associated with longer reaction time. So maybe they were kind of spending more time thinking about it and not going with their kind of first response. That was kind of the interpretation at the time. But really, you can see that the percentage variance explained is not very high. So we are finding some association, but it's not kind of a massive association between inhibitory control performance and counterintuitive reasoning. And then in another study and a smaller group of participants, again, adolescents, we were trying to see, okay, previous studies have shown when the neural correlates of counterintuitive reasoning, and they find prefrontal cortex activation and they say it reflects inhibitory control, but it hasn't really been tested directly. So what we were trying to do is get the same participants to do the counterintuitive reasoning tasks and to inhibitory control tasks in a scanner, and to see whether actually we did find overlap between the two. So this is kind of there's quite a lot on these slides, but it's just kind of the best way to show you overlap. So in blue, again, it was a complex go, no go task, which has a kind of one back working memory requirement, and not the simple one where we didn't see much activation. So that's shown in blue. And these are slices from kind of lower in the brain going up in the brain. And in red is looking at science and maths counterintuitive trials versus control trials, so the ones that are not counterintuitive. And you can see there are some regions of overlap in the more ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and kind of parietal cortex, as well as kind of more superior aspect of the frontal cortex. But it's not full overlap. So there are also a number of brain regions recruited in the science and maths counterintuitive reasoning contrasts that are not shown in the inhibitory control task. And the same for a Stroop task. Again, we find some overlap in some regions, actually overlapping for all three tasks. But again, not a full overlap. So for example, these regions here, not showing any overlap with the inhibitory control tasks. So this shows, some overlap. So yes, but the conclusion is like, if you were just doing like the studies before and saying, okay, well, look, we've got ventrolateral prefrontal cortex activation, this shows inhibitory control. You can't really make that conclusion if you haven't really demonstrated it. That it does actually overlap in the same participants in an inhibitory control task. But the overlap is not full. And then the problem with fMRI is that you might have overlap spatially, but it might not be the same neural population. So it might be actually different neurons in that brain regions are involved in these different tasks. So in the second step, we also looked at multivariate analysis, whereby you look at in a particular region of interest, you look at the fluctuations or the differences in activation across voxels. And each voxel might have a slightly different number of neurons that might be interested in, let's say, inhibitory control or counterintuitive reasoning. And if you find that the fluctuations don't relate at all to each other, that suggests that it would be different neural populations that are supporting the cognitive processes. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say about the second one. We also look at comparing correct trials versus incorrect trials. So the previous one was all misconception trials together, whether they answered correctly or not. And this is just looking whether they answered correctly, suggesting that when they're answering correctly, that might be that they might have recruited inhibitory control to do this. And in this contrast, there's a lot less activation overall in terms of difference between correct and incorrect trials. But again, there is some overlap in the parietal cortex with the inhibitory control tasks. So the multivariate analysis, again, it's quite a lot here, but we were looking at in these brain regions recruited for the science and math task, is there any kind of multivariate similarity between the science and math task and the STROOP or the go-no-go? And we find in terms of these are correlation tests that we're trying to see whether they're significantly greater than 0. And we find that there's some evidence in the right BA40, so the right parietal cortex for both tasks. And this is comparing in a way, it's sort of validating a little bit this approach, showing that actually when you compare the two inhibitory control tasks, you see a lot of overlap. So comparing the two inhibitory control tasks to each other, there seems to be the same neural populations involved in these two tasks. And this is for overall counterintuitive versus control. This is looking at correct versus incorrect trials. The evidence is kind of a little bit stronger again for these parietal regions, showing some neural overlaps in the science and math task and in the inhibitory control tasks. But it's not, the whole network, and we're not finding it in prefrontal cortex regions. So there is maybe some spatial overlap, but in terms of the neural population, maybe it's only in the parietal cortex that we're seeing some more actual kind of neural population overlap. And then the question is that actually inhibitory control then? Because parietal cortex is not a region that's been kind of specifically associated with inhibitory control. It's been associated with executive functions much more broadly, and maybe the multi-demand system, which is a whole set of kind of brain regions involved whenever you're doing something a little bit harder, that's been proposed by kind of John Duncan. And so maybe what we're seeing here is more related to kind of attentional demands of the task and with kind of general load demands rather than something specific about inhibitory control. So just to summarize this bit, there are individual differences in cognitive control associated with academic achievement. Reasoning about counterintuitive concepts may rely particularly on inhibitory control, but the behavioral associations we found in adolescence are quite small. Previous studies show activation in inconsistent prefrontal cortex regions, and we found partial overlap between neural correlates in terms of the location, but the multivariate analysis suggests maybe only the parietal cortex show kind of specific neural overlap. So the last bit, I wanted to talk about cognitive control training. So if individual differences in cognitive control impact academic achievement, so I've kind of talked about this evidence showing associations, can cognitive control lead to improvements in academic achievement? And that's what Melanie was kind of talking about in part, as the school's trying to train cognitive control and executive functions. And the whole idea is that, well, if they're really related, if you improve cognitive control, hopefully it will transfer and you will improve academic achievement as well. So can you train cognitive control? And this has been tried kind of initially with working memory quite a lot. And the idea again is that if working memory predicts arithmetic, reading, following instructions, attending in a classroom, if you practice a task, that means you're improving your the brain system supporting working memory. Hopefully it will transfer, and that means you will also improve arithmetic, reading, etc. And so this has been tried with repeated computerized practice on kind of, for example, in the CogMed program, where children do a whole range of different games that look at different verbal or kind of numerical and kind of spatial working memory. And the finding in general is that executive functions do improve. So they improve on the tasks they practice, but they also improve on tasks they haven't practiced. So different tasks of working memory. But unfortunately, there is little transfer to other domains. And in terms of improvement and other issues, in terms of individual differences, is actually sometimes it's rather than the children with really low work memory improving, you find that actually it's the children who already have quite a good work memory that might improve more, as if there is kind of maybe some genetic, and we can talk more about that in a discussion if you want, but some kind of limit to why these children don't have a higher work memory to start with. So another approach, which is the one we've tried to use in this particular Stop and Think program, is, we're looking here at inhibitory control, if inhibitory control is associated with science and maths misconceptions and kind of turn taking, for example, if you encourage children to kind of stop and think about their response and not go immediately with their first response, could they improve on their performance? So rather than focusing on the skill itself, we're trying to kind of more about whether you're using your skill. So it's not necessarily improving children inhibitory control, but whether they can use the inhibitory control and making it context specific. So you still have repeated practice, but the suggestion is that actually, doing training in a kind of domain general way doesn't seem to be helping. So maybe we need to go back and doing in a more domain specific way. So how can we do that? How can we engage children or adults even to engage in more slower logical reasoning rather than going for the intuitive response? And this was studied a while ago by Olivier Houdet in Paris. And we're using this kind of game that's quite often decision-making kind of logical game. And this one is like, which card have to be turned to verify the rule? And the rule is if there is A on one side of the card, then there is a 3 on the other. And so typically adult would say, okay, I'm going to flip the A to check whether there's a 3 on the other side. And then they would say, I'm going to flip the 3 to check there's an A on the other side. But actually, we are driven to do that because we have a 3 here, so we're primed to look at the 3. But in fact, the correct card to flip is the 7, because you want to check that there isn't an A on the other side, because that would be breaking the rule. Because there's nothing to, let's say, that a B could be leading to a 3. It's not a problem. It's not breaking the rule for a B to be on the other side of the 3. But if there's an A, you need to have a 3. So it's kind of a logical problem. But in a study, they try to get adults to do better on this task and explain to adults that in this problem, the source of the error lies in the habit we all have of concentrating on cards of the letter or number mentioned in the rule and not paying attention to the other cards. So the goal here is to not fall into the trap of the 2 cards, A and 3 mentioned in the rule, and to consider all of the cards. And then you kind of, let's consider the different answers and eliminate the wrong ones, the ones that make you fall into the trap, to find the right answer. So what they found was that actually these warning elements were necessary. The logic of the problem was not sufficient. Explaining the logic was not sufficient. You had to watch out, this is an error, it's misleading. But when they did that, they found that after the training, when they kind of gave the more logical answer, adults recruited more prefrontal cortex when they were solving these problems than before the training. Similarly, I don't have time to show you the video, but Adele Diamond has kind of done work with little children where they do a task, and sort of inhibitory control task, where they're shown a picture of a moon and they have to say day, and shown a picture of the sun and they have to say night. So they have to inhibit the intuitive answer, which would be day and night, and say the reverse. And she found kind of young children have a lot of trouble doing this. And she found that if you actually forced them to wait, but she was singing a little song for like 10 seconds, and then asking the children to give the answer, their accuracy was much better. So if you force them to delay their response, then you can get a better accuracy. So based on this kind of type of research, we were trying to develop an intervention to make children aware of the existence of counterintuitive concepts. So like Olivier Houdet was like, this awareness and kind of flagging the fact that they are misleading problems was important. And then training them to use the inhibitory control skills to successfully solve counterintuitive problems. And they would practice this for 10 weeks, 3 times a week at the start of math and science lesson. They would do it 12 minutes per session. And each session would cover 1 science and 1 maths counterintuitive concept that were adapted in content to 7-8-year-olds and 9-10-year-olds. So this was a massive project funded by the Education Endowment Fund and Wellcome, with whole range led by Professor Denis Maréchal, and including kind of by from the Center for Education Neuroscience and people from Birkbeck, UCL, and learners. And so the way it works was this kind of computerized game, and as if sort of where you have kind of multiple person doing the game, and then you have this person, Andy, was asking you questions, and then having this stop and think logo where children could not answer immediately, and then you show everyone thinking, so enforcing a delay, everyone kind of thinking about the answer, and then eventually you can let the children respond. And then depending on whether they get it correct or not, you might have different loops. You might kind of go through what the other children are thinking, but you might have another go, but every time you have to stop and think about it. And so this was funded by as kind of very large randomized controlled trial. So first in the kind of a promising pilot study, then a very large randomized controlled trials. We've an active control condition in half of the control classes and independent evaluators. There was a pre-training measure. So the main was the main outcome measure, which was of interest for the Education Endowment Foundation, were standardized tests in maths and science. And the pre-training measure was not exactly the same, mainly because of cost and time, but they used the kind of foundation stage profile, so kind of a school measure that had already been collected. And so the independent evaluators found that across years, there was a statistically significant 2 months improvement in science and non-significant 1 month improvement in maths. So this is the kind of the raw scores. So math year 3, year 5, year 3, year 5, the intervention group and the control group, just to kind of show you the kind of the size of the effect. And this is the actual effect size, G here. So for year 3, year 5, and combining the year groups. And so it was significant for science, but not kind of, it didn't reach significance for maths, unfortunately. But you can see that in both cases, it was driven by the year 5 children. So the year 5 children seem to be benefiting more from the intervention. We can talk more about it kind of later, but kind of subsidiary analysis look at maybe different SES group, but then you kind of have a power effect issue, but maybe for kind of lower SES children, the kind of effect for maths was bigger, but maybe particularly for year 3 children. We were interested in trying to understand more about the mechanism. So the Welcome allowed us to look at a subset of children and doing kind of a larger battery of cognitive tasks pre and post. And we also had to do a second wave because we didn't have enough participants. Really hard to recruit enough participants when you know you have the intervention starting. So once it started, that's it. You have to end your recruitment. So we ended up kind of doing in 2 waves. But in this subset of participants, we found that pre-training, verbal working memory, but not inhibitory control, was associated with counterintuitive reasoning in the kind of year 5, 9 to 10-year-old children. And in terms of training effect, we did find significant improvement on a counterintuitive reasoning task specifically. So the big project was looking at the maths and science achievement very much broadly. And we found it in 7, 8-year-olds, but not the older children. So this is kind of just illustrating the effect this is the control group, and this is the stop and think children, where we find kind of an improvement in performance on these misconception trials in the year 3 children in the stop and think. But importantly, we tried to see whether the improvements in performance were associated with individual differences in executive functions at time 1. But we didn't find that. So it wasn't the case that children who had, let's say, poor inhibitory control or poor working memory at time 1 benefited more from the training. It seems to be kind of irrelevant. And we also found no effect, no improvement on executive functions, but we didn't predict any because, as I said, we were trying to improve the use of inhibitory control in this context rather than inhibitory control per se. So now we're kind of trying to refine interventions. So Andrea Gauthier has been trying to look at improving the cues. So maybe using color and motion to make the stop and think cue more like children will focus more on that. You might have to click on a button to say, I'm ready now. So you have kind of say when you kind of thought about it and you're ready to do it. She also tried to find whether a reward penalty system might help. Actually didn't seem to. If anything, it hindered performance, but the other kind of more gamification kind of improved performance. So just to summarize this last bit, repeated practice of executive function tasks does not lead to consistent transfer effects to academic achievement. And so at least from kind of some studies, training strategy within a particular domain might be more beneficial. But overall, when you do these interventions, you need kind of quite a large N to find effects. So we only found, this positive effect. So it's, 2 months improvement across year groups for an intervention that lasts 10 weeks, which is, pretty much 2.5 months. It's quite a lot if you think about it. Like 2 months is not much, but compared to the length of the intervention is actually quite a lot. But it's kind of a small effect, and if you have much smaller sample size, it's much harder to find this significant effect. It also means that it's harder to study the mechanism through which they might have an impact, because you're limited to these kind of smaller samples when you're doing these big batteries of tasks. You need interdisciplinary teams to do these projects, which is what we discovered. So in terms of contact with school recruitment, but also people who are much more experienced in making those games, people finding the relevant problems from the educational topics. Again, the topics covered were relevant to each year group. And it takes a while to refine the intervention, and there's not always time to do this and to test this properly, but it's kind of quite an interesting route as well. So just to end there, cognitive control and executive functions show prolonged maturation and large individual differences. Executive functions play a role in academic achievement. Domain general training of executive functions, unfortunately, because of course it would have been the holy grail if you just train work memory by doing some video games and then you improve maths and everything, that would have been great. But it does not seem sufficient to lead to transfer to academic achievement. Domain specific training might be more successful and possibly when thinking more about strategies. But there are other options which maybe you can discuss in the Q&A, which would be kind of broader self-regulation training. So for example, Diamond and Ling have kind of, Adele Diamond has done kind of quite a lot trying to advocate kind of maybe cognitively enriched physical activity. There's some kind of evidence, but I think there's not much data yet for mindfulness. I've done a study that found some effect on attention in adolescence, but it's not the panacea. So mindfulness might improve some specific aspects of cognition, but really more evidence is needed about this. So thank you for your attention. I just want to mention a recent book that we got published with, edited with Michael Thomas and Denis Maréchal about educational neuroscience, and the website for the Unlock project, the Center for Educational Neuroscience, on my website, in case you want to find more information. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Iroise, for this great talk. Very impressive.